I have watched the world change beneath my feet, not through the roar of war, but through the quiet erosion of belief. For decades, we were told that the 20th century had ended with triumph, that the United States had ascended not only as the world's superpower, but as its moral compass. It was called the American century, a century of democracy, prosperity, and order. But standing here now, I can tell you this, that century is over, not with defeat, but with disbelief. The real collapse of an empire never begins with invasion. It begins when its story stops, convincing even its own people. And today, the story of American exceptionalism, that noble myth of destiny and virtue, has lost its audience. I know this not from theory, but from experience. I spent my life inside that myth, advising governments, walking the halls of Washington, believing that the system, however flawed, still sought to do good. But over the years, I watched as good intentions hardened into dogma and dogma into delusion. The empire that once promised freedom began to fear it. It built walls, both physical and psychological. It replaced diplomacy with dominance, dialogue with dictates, and in doing so, it began to rot from within. When I first traveled through post-Soviet Russia in the 1,990 seconds, I carried the optimism of an age that believed in progress and globalization, in cooperation, in peace through trade. But what I saw was something else, the seeds of humiliation planted by arrogance, an empire rising not to rebuild, but to reshape the world in its own image. Washington believed it was writing the future. In truth, it was erasing the past and itself. Every decision made in the name of democracy, promotion, was a lesson in irony. Each war fought for peace only deepened instability. Each sanction imposed for justice only punished the innocent. I watched as entire nations became laboratories for ideology, economies dismantled, societies destabilized, people dehumanized, all under the banner of progress. And in those ruins, the American project began to lose its soul. The moment came slowly. Then all at once, the wars that were supposed to make the world safer left it shattered. The institutions meant to preserve order became instruments of chaos, and the moral high ground, once proudly occupied, sank under the weight of its own contradictions. The American century was not supposed to end this way, in debt, division, and disillusionment. It was supposed to be the beacon of modernity. But what is modernity without morality? What is freedom without truth? I remember a speech I once gave in Washington. I said, a nation cannot lead the world if it cannot lead itself. Some applauded politely, others looked away, but no one disagreed because deep down they knew it was true. The great paradox of America is that it believed it could preserve its power by denying change, but history does not bargain. The same arrogance that once fueled greatness now guarantees decline. And yet, this is not a story of hatred. It is a story of mourning because the ideals that America betrayed were not false, they were forgotten. The tragedy is not that the empire fell, the tragedy is that it could have led the world into wisdom, but chose instead to lead it into fear. When I speak to young people today, I tell them empires do not die when their armies are defeated. They die when their dreams are no longer shared. And the American dream, that belief in endless growth, endless victory, endless virtue, has become a ghost haunting its own creators. I walk through New York sometimes past the monuments of ambition, the skyscrapers, the trading floors, the screens glowing with numbers. It all looks alive, but it feels hollow, an empire mistaking movement for meaning. The world is moving on. New powers rise, not through conquest, but through connection. They do not seek to replace Washington's throne. They seek to build a world without one. And that perhaps is the greatest irony of all. The empire that once sought to dominate the globe has taught it to live without empires. So here we are at the twilight of the American century, not with fire, but with fatigue, not with revolution, but with recognition. The world no longer believes in saviors, it believes in survival. And survival in the 21st century will depend not on power, but on truth. The American century is over. What comes next will be written not by those who ruled, but by those who endured. Every empire believes it can outlast time. Every generation of rulers convinces itself that history has reached its end and that they are its authors. I have lived long enough to see that illusion break again and again. The American empire was no different. For decades, it wrapped its decline in the language of strength. It told the world that its leadership was indispensable, that without Washington, there would be chaos. But what it never admitted was that the chaos had already begun, and it came not from the outside, but from within. I remember the first signs. They did not appear on battlefields or in headlines, but in trust eroding slowly, invisibly, like rust on iron. The institutions that once bound America together, its universities, its courts, its press, began to corrode from the inside. Each scandal was explained away, each lie defended as necessary, but rot spreads quietly before it breaks the surface. And when it finally does, it is too late. The myth of American leadership, the idea that this nation stood as a moral beacon for the world, was not destroyed by its enemies. It was suffocated by its own hypocrisy. I have watched presidents declare that democracy is under threat while their own government spied on journalists, imprisoned whistleblowers, and silenced dissent in the name of security. They preached the sanctity of free markets while engineering monopolies that devoured entire economies. They spoke of human rights while selling weapons to regimes that buried them. Each contradiction chipped away at credibility. Each betrayal widened the fracture between America's words and its reality. The unraveling did not happen overnight. It was slow, methodical, like the quiet unraveling of thread on a great tapestry. At first, the image still looked whole, but pull one thread too many, and suddenly the pattern disappears. By the early 2020 seconds, the unraveling had become impossible to ignore. The wars had failed. The sanctions had backfired. The global south was turning away, building its own alliances, its own currencies, and its own order. And yet, Washington still spoke the language of supremacy, as if repetition could replace relevance. In meeting after meeting, I heard the same refrain: we must lead, we must contain, we must preserve our position. But the world was no longer listening. It had grown tired of being told who to follow. It was no longer impressed by power without principle. When I spoke about this publicly, I was told I was ungrateful, that I had benefited from the system. I now criticized. They were right. I had benefited, and that is precisely why I could see how fragile it had become. Empires collapse, not because they are hated, but because they become predictable, because they mistake dominance for destiny, because they stop asking the only question that keeps civilizations alive: what is our purpose? The unraveling of America was not a geopolitical event, it was a moral one. It began when profit replaced principle, when fear replaced faith, and when the pursuit of power replaced the pursuit of peace. I saw this most clearly in the response to global crises, pandemics, climate disasters, economic meltdowns. Each exposed the same truth: a system built to serve the few cannot sustain the many. And yet, instead of reflection, there was denial. Instead of humility, hubris. I often think of the Roman Empire in its final century: magnificent, wealthy, blind. Its citizens still believed in glory, even as their leaders sold it piece by piece. History never repeats exactly, but it rhymes with terrifying precision. When the American system began exporting fear instead of hope, surveillance instead of support, punishment instead of partnership, the unraveling accelerated. I remember walking through Washington one winter evening, long after the crowds had gone. The monument stood glowing under floodlights, white marble, perfect, immortal. But I knew better. Marble cracks, statues crumble. Ideals fade when the hands that built them forget why they were built. That night, I realized something I had never dared admit aloud: America's greatest threat was not external, it was existential. It was the slow suffocation of its own spirit beneath the weight of self worship. The unraveling was not only political, but also psychological. The country had built an identity so dependent on being the greatest that it could not survive being merely good. It is hard to imagine a world where leadership means humility instead of dominance, but that world was already emerging. China, India, Brazil, and other nations, once labeled as developing, were now defining their own destinies. The global South, long treated as an audience, had become an actor. Trade routes shifted, currencies diversified, alliances multiplied. It was not a rebellion, it was evolution, and yet Washington saw in every change a threat. It responded not with curiosity, but with containment, not with cooperation, but with confrontation. And every confrontation only deepened its isolation. By 2026, the unraveling was undeniable. The world's faith in the American century had vanished. What remained was the empire's shadow, powerful but hollow. I was asked once at a conference, Professor Sachs, what will replace American leadership? I answered, nothing will replace it. The world is outgrowing the need to be led. That is the truth. The empire cannot accept, because to accept it would mean facing its greatest fear, irrelevance. The unraveling of the American century is not a tragedy. It is a reckoning, and reckoning, though painful, is how civilizations remember what they once were and what they might still become. The age of dominance is ending. The age of dialogue is beginning. And though the old powers resist, history has already made its choice. The unraveling is not the end. It is the unveiling, the moment when illusion gives way to awareness. And when awareness returns, no empire, however mighty, can hold back the truth. Empires don't just fall from power, they fall from truth. And before they collapse in the world, they collapse in the mind. The American empire became, above all, an empire of illusions, a civilization that mistook appearance for achievement, perception for principle, and dominance for destiny. It wasn't simply a political system, it was a theater. And for decades, I was among its audience. I remember the first time I stood before the U.S. Capitol, gleaming white against a cloudless sky. I was younger then, full of belief in what America claimed to be the defender of liberty, the architect of peace, the light of modern civilization. But what I didn't yet understand was that behind every shining column, there were shadows, invisible forces, scripting the narrative, shaping what the world was meant to see. The illusion began as a dream, and like all dreams, it felt beautiful while it lasted. In classrooms, we were told America stood for freedom. In reality, freedom became a brand exported, marketed, and sold, often at gunpoint, in the media. We were told America defended democracy. In truth, democracy became a performance, a set of gestures, elections choreographed between two sides funded by the same interests. In the economy, we were told that the market would lift all boats, but as the tides of greed rose, millions were left stranded on dry land. I saw the illusion spread like light across glass, dazzling but thin. It reflected everything, yet revealed nothing. The empire had mastered the art of narrative warfare. Truth was no longer discovered, it was produced. Wars were no longer justified by necessity, but by the power of storytelling. The victims were erased. The villains were named. The heroes were branded. And every story had the same ending. The empire was always right. When I began to question this, when I pointed out that the wars of liberation created deserts of despair, I was told I had lost perspective, but perspective was exactly what they feared, because perspective exposes proportion, and proportion reveals hypocrisy. I still remember a conversation I had with a senior official during the Iraq War. He said, Jeff, you don't understand. People don't care about reality. They care about the story. That was when I realized the empire was no longer governing, it was directing. And we, the citizens of the world, had become extras in its production. The illusion ran deep. It wasn't just in Washington. It was in Hollywood, in Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, each a cathedral of spectacle. Every movie, every commercial, every social media campaign whispered the same promise: you are free, because we tell you that you are. Meanwhile, the system that proclaimed liberty monitored its people more closely than any regime it condemned. It sold surveillance as convenience. It called censorship responsibility. It turned obedience into virtue. The empire no longer needed to silence dissent. It only needed to drown it in noise. I call this the age of simulation, an era where everything looked alive, but nothing truly lived, where the illusion of democracy, mass oligarchy, the illusion of progress concealed decay, and the illusion of morality excused endless wars. I saw the same faces move from government to corporations to think tanks and back again, a revolving door of power, wearing different masks, but serving the same masters. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was culture, a culture of control so normalized that no one questioned its ethics. And in this empire of illusions, truth became a liability. When whistleblowers spoke, they were exiled. When journalists investigated, they were demonized. When citizens protested, they were labeled extremists. The empire's tolerance for dissent ended where its reflection began. Even academia, once a sanctuary for independent thought, was absorbed into the illusion. Research became propaganda. Data became dogma. And universities became subsidiaries of corporate ideology. I saw colleagues self-censor, fearing they would lose grants or reputation. It was not repression by force, it was repression by fear. And the illusion endured because it was comforting. It told Americans they were virtuous even when they were complicit. It told allies they were sovereign even when they were subjects. It told the world it was free even as it chained itself to debt, distraction, and delusion. But illusions have a price, and that price is reality. You can bend perception for decades. Truth breaks through, and when it does, it shatters not only the illusion, but the faith that sustained it that's what I saw happen in the mid 2020 seconds. The curtain finally tore. The media lost its monopoly on meaning. The wars lost their moral camouflage, and the empire, stripped of narrative, stood naked before the world. The shock wasn't just external, it was internal. Americans, for the first time in generations, began to see the reflection they had avoided. They saw inequality not as an accident, but as a design. They saw their democracy not as a beacon, but as a brand. And in that moment of recognition, the empire's greatest fear came true. People began to wake up. The empire of illusions could survive anything except awareness. I've said it before, and I will say it again. Truth is not fragile. It is only delayed, and when it returns, it arrives not as an idea, but as a force unstoppable, unforgiving, illuminating. The American empire still stands, but its reflection no longer deceives. Its citizens no longer cheer at the theater. They are walking out quietly, one by one, because the greatest act of resistance in an empire of illusion is to simply open your eyes. Power, when it cannot persuade, learns to program. By the early 21st century, the American empire had evolved into something far more sophisticated than armies or colonies. It had become invisible, an architecture of control, soft, seamless, global, built not on force, but on influence, not on occupation, but on information. I began to see it clearly after years of working inside the system. It was not a conspiracy. It was coordination, government, finance, and technology, four pillars moving as one organism, each feeding the other, each reinforcing the illusion of freedom while managing its boundaries. It began innocently, even rationally. The state needed intelligence, corporations needed access, universities needed funding, media needed narratives, and slowly, imperceptibly, necessity became dependency, dependency became alignment, and alignment became obedience. By the 2010 seconds, the lines had vanished entirely. The same men who wrote the laws also wrote the algorithms. The same firms that financed wars financed the news that justified them. The same platforms that promised communication became tools of surveillance, and beneath it all pulsed the same logic controlled the story, and you controlled the world. When I spoke about this in conferences, I was told, Professor, that sounds like paranoia. But paranoia implique imagination. What I saw was simply structured, deliberate, systematic, and astonishingly efficient. The new empire did not need to silence opposition. It learned to simulate it. It built spaces for dissent, safe, digital cages where outrage could echo harmlessly, contained by the very algorithms that provoked it. People believed they were rebelling online. In truth, They were rehearsing obedience, shouting inside a theater built by their own captors. I once visited a major tech company in California. In the lobby hung a mural that read, "Connect the world," but I knew what it really meant. Map the world. Every connection was data. Every word, a pattern. Every emotion, a signal. Those signals fed into the same system, predictive, profitable, and political. The dream of Silicon Valley had merged with the ambitions of Washington. The result was a perfect symbiosis. Technology made the empire frictionless, and the empire made technology untouchable. When a company becomes too large to fail, it becomes too valuable to regulate. And when a government became too powerful to trust, it outsourced its conscience to code. I called it the algorithmic state, a new form of governance without accountability, a dictatorship of convenience. It didn't need ideology, only data. It didn't need propaganda, only personalization. And it didn't need violence because it could predict disobedience before it occurred. The architects of control were not generals or presidents. They were engineers, investors, consultants, quiet, educated, fluent in both ethics and evasion. They believed they were building tools. They were, in fact, building cages, transparent, addictive, comfortable, and people loved their cages. The empire no longer needed permission to watch. It was invited in through our screens, our searches, our voluntary surrender of privacy disguised as progress. The brilliance of this system was its subtlety. It didn't tell you what to think. It simply decided what you would see. I remember a chilling moment at a cybersecurity summit in Geneva. A senior intelligence official leaned over and said, "The greatest weapon of the 21st century is convenience." He was right. The more convenient life became, the less control people realized they had over their lives. Freedom had been redefined not as independence, but as efficiency, not as choice, but as access. And access was permission that could be granted or revoked at any time. This is how the empire learned to survive modernity. It became fluid. It became digital. It became moral, presenting its control as safety, its censorship as compassion, its manipulation as management. When the empire of illusions met the architecture of control, the result was total absorption, a world where everything was true somewhere and false everywhere else, where objectivity no longer existed, only ownership. I watched this machine grow stronger with every crisis. Each pandemic, each war, each financial collapse became an opportunity to centralize authority further. The message was always the same: we must protect you from chaos. But the chaos was their creation, and the protection, their profit. I was once asked at a private forum in Brussels, Professor Sachs, "Are you saying democracy is dead?" I answered, "No. I'm saying democracy has been digitized, and whoever owns the code owns the country." That was the silence that followed, not of disagreement, but of recognition, because deep down, everyone in that room knew the system could no longer distinguish between governance and manipulation. It had merged them. The architects of control were not villains in the classical sense. They were believers, believers in efficiency, in order, in the myth that humanity could be optimized, but optimization is not wisdom, and control is not civilization. Empires of the past enslaved bodies. This one enslaves perception. And as I watch it unfold, I am reminded of something I wrote years ago. Power will always find new shapes, but the human soul must remain formless if it wishes to stay free. The question now is simple and terrifying when the algorithm knows us better than we know ourselves. Who do we become? That is not a technological question. It is a moral one, and it will decide whether the 21st century ends in awakening or in perfect obedience. Empires once built their power with stone walls and standing armies. Today, their walls are invisible, made of code, convenience, and consent. We refer to it as the digital world, but what it truly is the great digital cage. I began to notice the bars long before most people did. At first, they were gilded, shimmering with promise. We were told technology would liberate us, connect us, and democratize knowledge. And for a brief, blinding moment, it did. Then slowly, it began to close. Each click, each swipe, each search, a record. Each record is a data point. Each data point, a piece of you, is sold to someone you'll never meet. I used to say, when a service is free, you are the product. Now, I know that's only half the truth. We are not just the product, we are the experiment. I've met the men who built this cage. They don't wear uniforms. They wear hoodies and optimism. They speak of efficiency, not empire. But their creations have done what no empire ever could. They have colonized the human mind. We no longer live under surveillance. We live within it. We build our lives inside the same networks that study us. We confess willingly our desires, our fears, our habits to algorithms that learn faster than any interrogator in history. It is a perfect system, self-updating, self-justifying, self-replicating. It doesn't need tyranny. It just needs your participation. When I traveled to Asia in the mid-2022, I saw two versions of the digital cage. In the West, it was sold as freedom, sleek, voluntary, invisible. In the East, it was enforced, visible, rigid, efficient, but the result was the same architecture, same prison. The illusion of choice is the most powerful form of control. People believe they are choosing their news, their leaders, their reality, but their choices are predicted, guided, refined, all before they even reach the screen. The empire of data doesn't need to ban your thoughts. It just needs to predict them. This was the moment when I realized the world had traded privacy for participation. We had built a civilization where identity itself became a commodity, likes became validation, attention became currency, truth became optional. And while we celebrated our newfound digital freedom, the architects of control governments, corporations, and intelligence agencies integrated their systems into a single one. Surveillance capitalism fused with state power. The watchers became the market. The market became the state. A colleague once told me, Jeff, the internet was humanity's mirror. I replied, no, it became its microscope. We were no longer reflected. We were dissected, and yet people didn't resist. They adapted because the cage didn't feel like confinement. It felt like comfort. Convenience is the new sedative of civilization. It keeps us connected, distracted, pacified, too busy scrolling to notice the shrinking space of our autonomy. When I spoke about this, audiences often asked, Professor, is it really that bad? And I would say it's worse because it feels so good. That is the genius of the digital cage. It doesn't punish disobedience. It rewards compliance. It measures happiness in engagement metrics. It turns dissent into data. And in doing so, it eliminates the very concept of rebellion. But here's the paradox that gives me hope. Every system that depends on control eventually collapses under the weight of awareness. The more perfectly a cage functions, the more fragile it becomes because perfection cannot tolerate, and awareness is spreading. Young people are waking up to the truth that their world has been curated, their reality engineered. They are beginning to ask the forbidden questions. Who controls the algorithm? Who writes the code of consent? In those questions lies the first crack in the cage. When I speak to students today, I tell them the greatest act of freedom in your generation is not to disconnect, it is to discern, because discernment is the new rebellion. It is the ability to see the machinery behind the magic. The digital cage was built to manage the human condition, but what it cannot calculate is the human spirit. Spirit does not optimize. Spirit defies prediction, and spirit, once awakened, cannot be coded. So, yes, the cage still stands. Its walls grow smarter every day. But so do we. History shows that no empire, no system, no algorithm lasts forever because none can contain the oldest force of all, the will to be free. And one day when the screens go dark, when the code falters, when humanity remembers that truth does not need Wi-Fi to exist, the cage will open, not with violence, but with vision. That is how all empires end, not with the shattering of glass, but with the opening of eyes. The end of every empire begins, not with defeat, but with disbelief. And in our age, disbelief is become the epidemic. By the late 2020 seconds, the foundation of modern civilization, trust, had begun to crumble. Trust in government, trust in science, trust in media, trust in truth itself. The collapse of trust is invisible at first. You don't see it in headlines or numbers. You feel it in the silence after the news, in the hesitation before belief. In the moment, people stop asking, is it true? And start asking, who says? So I watched it happen from the inside. Governments that once claimed moral authority had lied too often, too easily, for too long. The press, once the conscience of democracy, had become its theater, science corrupted by funding, politics, and fear lost its neutrality. And the people, tired of manipulation, turned away from all of it. It wasn't cynicism, it was self-defense. The collapse of trust is the final stage of empire, when every institution has been weaponized for image, and every truth must pass through a filter of suspicion. By 2025, you could feel the fatigue setting in every crisis, pandemic, war, election. Scandal felt staged, orchestrated, familiar. The narratives changed, but the tone stayed the same. The script never evolved. Only the actors did. I saw citizens stop watching the news, not out of ignorance, but out of instinct. They sensed that truth no longer lived there. I remember a young man asking me after a lecture in Amsterdam, Professor, how do we know what's real anymore? I told him, you don't, you feel it, and then you test what you feel against what you can prove. That's how we rebuild truth, one conscience at a time. But for most people, that process had already broken down. Social media, once a tool for connection, had become a maze of mirrors. Every opinion reflected infinitely, amplified, distorted, weaponized. The algorithm had no allegiance except engagement, and outrage was the most profitable product. Truth had no chance in a marketplace designed for attention. The result was chaos, deliberate, engineered chaos, because chaos is control's oldest ally. When people no longer believe in anything, they can be made to believe in anyone. I began to see this psychological decay everywhere, nations divided not by ideology, but by perception, neighbors speaking of different realities, families torn apart by narratives written for them, not by them. This is what I call the crisis of meaning. It is not political, it is existential. A society that cannot agree on reality, cannot build one. And while the public blamed each other, left against right, rich against poor, the architects of control smiled. They knew that a divided public is a manageable public. In that darkness, opportunists emerged, influencers, pundits, and politicians selling certainty in an age that was increasingly allergic to it. They offered tribes instead of truth, belonging instead of understanding, and people desperate for something to trust accepted the trade. But trust built on fear is not trust. It is a dependency. I remember sitting with a group of journalists in London off record. One of them said, "We can't tell the truth anymore. It's not that we're forbidden, it's that no one would believe us." That sentence chilled me more than any censorship law could, because when disbelief becomes universal, truth becomes irrelevant. That is the moment when civilizations turn inward, not to reflect, but to retreat. Each faction builds its own reality, complete with its own facts, heroes, and villains. It is the digital equivalent of the Tower of Babel, 1,000 tongues speaking, none listening. I've often said the fall of truth does not create darkness. It creates noise, a blinding, endless noise. And in that noise, power hides. The empire had perfected the art of disorientation. While the public argued over illusions, the machinery of control continued silently, undisturbed. The wars went on, the money flowed, the system fed itself while the people fought over shadows. And yet, amidst that collapse, something began to stir. Disbelief, once destructive, began to transform into discernment. People began to see patterns. They began to recognize the choreography of manipulation. And in that recognition, a new form of awareness was born. Truth, after all, never dies. It hibernates, waiting for the noise to exhaust itself. The collapse of trust was not the end of civilization. It was the end of illusion. And every end, however painful, is also a beginning, because when you lose trust in authority, you are forced to rediscover trust in yourself. And that, I told my students, is where real democracy begins again, not in the halls of power, but in the conscience of the awakened. Revolutions used to be fought with weapons. Now they begin with realization. By 2027, the world had entered a strange and silent rebellion, not of armies, but of awareness. People were waking up, not through ideology, but through exhaustion. They were tired of being manipulated, tired of being afraid, tired of being told what to think, who to hate, what to believe. This was not a revolution of slogans or manifestos. It was something quieter, the revolt of the human mind reclaiming its own agency. For decades, control had been psychological. The empire had learned to dominate not through coercion, but through conditioning. It fed people stories until they mistook them for truth, comfort until they mistook it for freedom, distraction until they mistook it for peace. But something changed. People stopped feeling safe inside the illusion. They began to sense its weight. I remember speaking to a group of students in Lisbon. One young woman stood up and said, "We don't trust the news. We don't trust the government. We don't even trust the influencers who tell us not to trust." Then she paused and added, "But we still trust each other if we can talk honestly." That sentence struck me. It was the first time I realized that awareness is contagious. Even in a world drowning in deceit, truth can still whisper from one conscience to another. Awareness begins as discomfort, the faint ache that something isn't right. But when shared, it becomes power. Across continents, this awakening took different forms. In America, it was anger, people rejecting the corruption of politics, the emptiness of consumerism, the hypocrisy of power. In Europe, it was grief, the slow realization that their sovereignty had been outsourced, their ideals commodified. In the global South, it was pride nations that had long been humiliated, finally realizing that dependency had been a choice, not a destiny. It was not a coordinated movement. It didn't need leaders, hashtags, or manifestos. It was deeper and emergent consciousness. The more the system tried to suppress it, the faster it spread. Censorship became its fuel. Propaganda became its proof. And fear, once the empire's greatest weapon, began to lose its grip. People started asking forbidden questions again. Why are wars always profitable for the same few? Why do crises always concentrate wealth? Why are we always told there is no alternative? Every question was a spark. Every spark, a signal proof that the age of passive obedience was ending. I began to see it everywhere in art, in music, in the subtle rebellion of honesty. Writers no longer wrote to please. Filmmakers no longer filmed to distract. The culture itself was beginning to turn against the machine that had fed it. The revolt of awareness was not loud. It was patient. It moved through conversation, through conscience, through the refusal to lie, even when lying was rewarded. And that I told my audiences is how civilizations begin again, not through conquest, but through clarity. In one conference in Seoul, a journalist asked me, Professor, do you think the system can survive this awakening? I answered, Système survive rébellion. They don't survive irrelevance, because once people stop believing in fear, the system that depends on it has nothing left to offer. Governments tried to adapt. They launched campaigns for digital literacy, which was really a plea for obedience. They built new AI tools to police misinformation, but every act of control only exposed their insecurity. They accused truth tellers of extremism, forgetting that extremism is often born from suppressed truth. The public, once silent, began speaking again, not through mobs, but through meaning. Farmers in France, truckers in Canada, teachers in Brazil, ordinary people refusing to live within the lie, not because they wanted chaos, but because they wanted coherence. The empire could handle protests. It could not handle awareness. You can disperse a crowd, you cannot disperse consciousness. And so it tried to distract again with new enemies, new spectacles, new fears. But the people had changed. They could still be entertained, but not hypnotized. That was the moment I knew something irreversible had begun. Humanity was remembering itself For centuries, we have been trained to see freedom as a form of permission. Now we were learning that freedom is a matter of perception. It is not granted, it is realized. Walked through the streets of Rome that summer. I saw graffiti that read, "We were asleep in comfort. We woke up in truth." I stopped and took a photo of it. That sentence encapsulated the entire century in one line. The revolt of awareness was not the end of the empire, it was the end of amnesia. People were remembering what it meant to think, to doubt, to question. And when humanity remembers, history moves. I have always believed that the greatest power on earth is not money or weapons, it is consciousness. And for the first time in decades, consciousness was rising faster than control could contain it. The age of manipulation was dying, not with revolution, but with recognition. And recognition, once awakened, cannot be unlearned. That is how freedom returns, not in crowds shouting slogans, but in minds whispering. I see it now. Power, like gravity, eventually turns inward. It devours itself. When awareness spread faster than control, the system began to panic. And when the architects of that system, the so-called masters of the world, could no longer contain the awakening, they turned on one another. It began quietly. Disagreements in the boardrooms of finance, conflicts within intelligence agencies, leaks, betrayals, anonymous briefings. At first, it appeared to be a dysfunction, but what it really was the empire cracking from the top down. For years, these men and women had believed themselves untouchable. They had managed nations like spreadsheets, economies like simulations, societies like markets. Their arrogance was mathematical. They truly believed humanity could be modeled, managed, and monetized. And for a while, it seemed to work. But when the revolt of awareness began, their models failed. Their predictions faltered. Their data betrayed them because the one variable they never accounted for, the one thing no algorithm could forecast, was the human spirit awakening to its own manipulation. They responded as all rulers do when cornered with fear disguised as order. I watched as governments rushed to consolidate even more power, claiming to fight disinformation. Media conglomerates accused one another of corruption. Corporations turned on their partners to save their image. The very network that had once been seamless began to tear. The alliance between technology and politics, once a sacred bond, broke first. Tech giants, pressured by governments, started leaking evidence of political coercion. Politicians, in turn, blamed the tech industry for undermining democracy. It was not democracy they feared losing, it was dominance. I recall a meeting at Economic Forum where a banking executive whispered to me, "We can manage markets," but not meaning the people don't believe us anymore. I replied, "They shouldn't. Belief without truth is slavery." He didn't argue. He simply looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes when privilege stops feeling permanent. Across the Atlantic, intelligence agencies began their own civil wars, leaks, counter leaks, Kiet purges, truth, once their greatest threat, had become their only weapon against one another. For the first time in decades, the veil of unity among the elites had been lifted. The global order, that invisible empire of mutual benefit, was fracturing into tribes of self-preservation. And that is how power dies, not in confrontation with the masses, but in competition among its creators. I had seen this pattern before in the fall of the Soviet Union, in the unraveling of empires past, but this time it was different. There was no ideology left to hide behind, only exposure. One by one, scandals erupted, financial manipulation, media collusion, corporate espionage. The public no longer gasped. They expected it. Corruption was no longer shocking. It had become an accepted norm. That is the final stage of empire, when wrongdoing becomes routine and truth becomes radical. The masters tried to reinvent themselves, rebranding tyranny as stability, exploitation as sustainability, and censorship as safety. But the mask no longer fit. People had learned to read between the lines, to feel the gap between words and reality. I recall being invited to a private dinner in Geneva, a table of CEOs, diplomats, and think tank analysts. They asked Professor Sachs, what happens if we lose control of the narrative? I told them, you already have, you're just the last to know. Silence fell over the table, because deep down, they sensed it, that the era of their mastery was ending. Power sustained by illusion cannot survive exposure to reality. And once people stop fearing their rulers, those rulers cease to exist in any meaningful sense. The fall of the masters did not happen in a single collapse. It happened in stages, board by board, deal by deal, speech by speech. The confidence that once filled global summits turned brittle. The unity that once defined the international order gave way to blame, and in the spaces between, truth began to seep through like light through cracked marble. The irony was poetic. They had built a system so interconnected that it could dominate the world. But that same interconnection ensured that when one part failed, everything else followed. Finance depended on the media. The media depended on politics. Politics depended on perception, and perception was collapsing. By the end of the decade, the masters stood exposed, not as visionaries, but as parasites feeding on us, no longer had the power to sell. Their wealth remained, their networks endured, but their authority, that invisible currency, had vanished. In the eyes of the people, they were no longer leaders. They were relics, and yet, as they fell, the world did not descend into chaos. It began to breathe, because beneath the architecture of control, life had endured unbought, ungoverned, unseen. Communities rebuilt trust locally. independent media rose from the ashes of propaganda, economies began to trade, not in speculation, but in substance. Humanity, in its quiet wisdom, was reclaiming itself. The fall of the masters was not a revolution of blood, it was a revolution of perception. It was the moment humanity remembered that authority is only real when it is believed to be so, and belief, once lost, is never regained. That is how the empire finally began to die. Not in fire, but in truth, not by rebellion, but by recognition. The masters had ruled the world through illusion, but they had forgotten the oldest law of history: illusions can be bought, but not forever, because the truth, however buried, as no master, history never ends. It only pauses long enough for the victors to mistake their dominance for destiny. By 2028, the illusion of permanence had shattered. The old world, the one built on the illusion of Western moral superiority and financial control, was collapsing under the weight of its own deceit. And from that collapse came a new reckoning, one not measured in wars or borders, but in conscience. The reckoning of empires had begun. It did not start in Washington or Brussels. It began in the silence between nations, in the corridors of diplomacy where polite arrogance had once ruled. For the first time in decades, world leaders spoke without rehearsed reverence for the United States. The spell had broken. The global South, long treated as a periphery, began to speak with one voice, not of rebellion, but of remembrance. They remembered the coups disguised as liberations, the loans that bled them dry, the wars fought in the name of freedom, and they began to ask the question that terrified the old order most: what if we no longer need you? I watched this shift unfold like the turning of a tide. In Africa, leaders refused the old financial traps. In Latin America, nations reconnected across old boundaries, trading resources without the dollar's permission. In Asia, partnerships flourished between countries once divided by Western interests. The empire had tried to divide the world for a century. Now, the world was dividing itself from the empire. For the West, it was a shock unlike any other. They had ruled for so long that equality felt like betrayal. They spoke of the rules-based order, but the rules were no longer theirs to write. And so they did what every fading power does. They clung to moral theater. Sanctions replaced diplomacy. Accusations replaced dialogue. And the louder they shouted about defending freedom, the more transparent their fear became. But the world had grown tired of listening to sermons from sinners. When I addressed the United Nations that year, I said, the era of empire is over. The era of accountability has begun. Some applauded, others shifted uneasily, but everyone understood what I meant. Accountability is the empire's final enemy, because once the world measures power by its consequences instead of its slogans, the empire has nowhere left to hide. The United States, long protected by distance and myth, now faced its own reflection. its wars had failed. Its economy was fracturing. Its people were disillusioned for decades. America had told the world it was the future. Now the world was moving on without it. Europe, too, faced its reckoning. For years, it had outsourced its sovereignty to Washington politically, militarily, even morally, but dependency had turned to humiliation as crises multiplied. Europe realized too late that obedience was not a guarantee of unity. I spoke to a European diplomat in Geneva who confessed we wanted partnership, but what we built was dependency. We thought we were allies, we were assets. That single sentence summed up the tragedy of the Atlantic Alliance. Meanwhile, the rest of the world, weary but wiser, began building a new architecture. It was imperfect, fragile, but real trade corridors between Africa and Asia, financial networks free from Western debt, cultural exchanges unfiltered by ideology. They referred to it as the multipolar world, but I preferred another term, the return of balance. The reckoning was not vengeance. It was equilibrium restoring itself. And yet, even as new alliances formed, I warned that the danger was not over. Empires rarely degracefully, they thrash, they lash out, they burn what they cannot control. And America, wounded but armed, was still capable of catastrophic denial. But something deeper was changing, something beyond politics. For the first time in centuries, nations were not just rejecting dominance, they were rediscovering dignity. I saw it in young diplomats who refused to echo Western talking points, in journalists who asked real questions, again, in ordinary people who no longer apologize for wanting independence. The empire's greatest fear had always been not rebellion, but self-respect, because a world that respects itself cannot be ruled. The reckoning of empires was not about punishment. It was about perspective, the world finally seeing power as it truly was, a fragile illusion sustained by consent. And that consent had evaporated as the dust of disillusionment settled. Something extraordinary began to emerge. A new moral geography, a recognition that power divorced from empathy is suicide, that progress without justice is regression, that humanity's survival depends not on who rules, but on who remembers. I remember standing one evening on a balcony overlooking the city of Nairobi. The skyline glowed with light, African light, not borrowed or imported. Beneath me, I saw a generation building its own future without permission, without apology. And I thought, this is how history heals. The empire's fall was not the end of order. It was the end of obedience. And from that ending rose something both ancient and new, the understanding that humanity's true empire is not over land or ideology, but over its own conscience. The reckoning of empires was not humanity's collapse, it was its correction. And that correction, painful as it was, gave birth to the only empire worth building, one built not on power, but on truth. History does not end in ruin. It ends in remembrance and begins again in reflection. By the dawn of the 2030 seconds, the smoke of empire had cleared. What remained was not chaos, but clarity. The world, long intoxicated by dominance, had sobered, and in that sobriety, humanity rediscovered something it had lost for centuries: balance. This was the beginning of what I came to call the Age of Restoration, not restoration of the old powers, not restoration of wealth or status, but restoration of meaning for generations. We were taught that progress meant speed, faster markets. Now we were learning to measure success differently, not by conquest, but by coexistence, not by dominance, but by dignity. Economies began to shift from extraction to regeneration. Technology, once used to manipulate, was reimagined to heal. Artificial intelligence became a tool of collaboration, not control. And nations, once trapped in competition, began to understand that cooperation was not a sign of weakness, it was a sign of survival. I once gave a conference in Buenos Aires. The 20th century taught us how to build machines. The 21st must teach us how to build meaning. They applauded not because it was poetic, but because it was true. The world had learned the cost of forgetting its soul. I visited Washington again in those years. The monuments still stood gleaming as ever, but their meaning had changed. They were no longer symbols of supremacy. They were memorials to ambition without wisdom, to progress without purpose, and yet I felt no anger, only understanding. Empires do not die in vain if humanity learns from their fall. And this time, we did the young had inherited a broken system, but they were building something extraordinary from its fragments, a decentralized, diverse, and grounded system in respect for the planet and for one another. They no longer sought to dominate the world. They sought to belong to it. That I realized was the truest restoration, the return of belonging, because what humanity had lost was not technology or wealth or power. It had lost connection to nature, to truth, to itself. And now, step by step, it was finding its way home. One evening in Kyoto, I sat by the Kamo River watching the sun dip below the hills. The water shimmered with gold, quiet, indifferent to empires. And I thought, this is what endures, not nations, not systems, but awareness, the quiet recognition that everything humanity needs, it already possesses. If only it remembers. The Age of Restoration was not utopia. There was still poverty, still conflict, still the scars of arrogance. But there was something new, a collective humility, a willingness to learn, a desire to listen. For the first time in centuries, humanity's story was no longer a tale of conquest. it was a conversation when I am asked now, Professor Sachs, what comes after empire? I answer conscience, because conscience is the final empire, the only one that does not demand obedience, only awareness. And that empire belongs to all of us. If the 20th century was the age of domination and the 21st the age of disillusionment, then the 22nd perhaps will be the age of restoration, where humanity finally learns that power without empathy is extinction. But empathy without fear is evolution. The empires have fallen, the masters have faded, and through the ashes of illusion, something ancient has returned, the understanding that truth, once remembered, can never again be ruled. That is how civilizations survive, not through power, but through peace, not through might, but through meaning. The age of restoration is not a prophecy. It is a possibility. And that possibility begins